The golden hues of the sunset painted the sky as I pulled into my driveway after weeks of high-stakes meetings. My mind buzzed with the weight of my new role as the soon-to-be-announced CEO of Harley-Davidson. But the excitement was short-lived. Something was wrong. A bright orange notice flapped against my garage door. My stomach dropped as I got closer. I ripped it off, eyes scanning the bold letters. Violation, unauthorized vehicle storage. Remove motorcycle within 48 hours or face immediate towing and fines. And below that, in perfect cursive handwriting, motorcycles decrease property values and attract an undesirable element to our community. Margaret Whitmore, our HOA president. I barely knew her, but in 6 months of living here, she had already made her presence felt. First, she fined me for my grass being half an inch too tall. Then, she sent her husband to measure my mailbox distance from the curb. Now she was coming for my bike. What she didn't know: that pristine 2023 Harley-Davidson Road Glide she despised was worth more than her luxury SUV. And the man she just targeted? He wasn't just a motorcycle enthusiast. He was about to take her entire operation down. I gripped the notice, feeling my blood simmer with frustration. Margaret Whitmore had crossed the line. My Harley wasn't just a bike. It was a symbol of freedom, craftsmanship, and history. And she had the audacity to call it undesirable? I took a deep breath. Losing my temper wouldn't help. If I wanted to beat her, I needed to be smart. I pulled out my phone and began documenting everything. The violation notice, my pristine, well-maintained driveway, my spotless 2023 Harley-Davidson Road Glide, gleaming under the porch light. Margaret wanted to play dirty? Fine. I'd make sure she had nowhere to hide. As I took photos, I heard a chuckle from across the street. "Shame about that bike," called Tom Peterson, my neighbor. He was leaning against his porch, garden hose in hand, smirking like he had already won. I turned to reply, but something caught my eye. A brand new tow truck parked in his driveway. The words "Peterson's Towing" were freshly painted on the side. And just like that, it all clicked. This wasn't about property values. It was a business. A scam. Margaret and Tom had found a way to use the HOA to line their own pockets. They created bogus violations, towed vehicles at outrageous fees, and forced homeowners to pay or lose their property. I suddenly remembered my neighbor, Mr. Jackson, who had to sell his classic Mustang after it was towed and impounded for months. The Garcias lost their family's vintage Triumph motorcycle while they were on vacation. Even Mrs. Chen's grandson had his first car towed from their driveway over a so-called parking violation. I stormed inside and flipped open my laptop. If there really was a rule against motorcycles, I needed to see it for myself. 3 hours and 2 cups of coffee later, I had my answer. No such rule existed. Margaret had made it up. But what I did find was even worse. Every single towing operation in the past year had been handled by Peterson's Towing, Tom's company. And the fees? Astronomical. Even more suspicious, the HOA had tripled the number of tows since Margaret took over as president. Then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed with a new HOA email. Subject: Emergency Board Meeting, Vehicle Policy Updates. I looked out the window. Margaret and Tom were in her driveway whispering. Every few seconds, they glanced toward my garage. They thought they had me. I smirked. What Margaret didn't know was that she hadn't just picked a fight with a motorcycle owner. She had just declared war on the CEO of Harley-Davidson. And I was about to make her regret every single move. My alarm hadn't even gone off when I woke to the buzzing of my phone. A motion alert from my security cameras. Groggy but alert, I grabbed my phone and tapped the notification. The grainy night vision footage sent a surge of adrenaline through my veins. A tow truck, backing into my driveway. My heart pounded as I threw on clothes and ran downstairs, but by the time I yanked open the front door, it was already too late. My pristine 2023 Harley-Davidson Road Glide. Gone. The truck's logo flashed in the dim morning light. Peterson's Towing. Rage bubbled in my chest. I jumped into my car and tore down the street, trying to follow the tow truck, but it had already disappeared around the corner. My phone buzzed. Margaret, HOA. Unauthorized vehicles have been removed. Office hours start at 9 a.m. It was 6 a.m. I clenched my jaw. She had planned this. The 48-hour window hadn't even expired, but she didn't care. Margaret had power, and she loved to use it. By 9 a.m. sharp, I was at the HOA office. I forced myself to stay calm as I pushed open the door. Margaret sat behind her desk like a queen on her throne, fingers tapping lazily on her keyboard. Across the room, Tom Peterson leaned back in a chair, twirling his tow truck keys. She barely looked up. "Mr. Zeitz, I have your paperwork right here." She slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a highlighted passage from an HOA rulebook. Article 7, Section 12. No recreational vehicles may be stored in driveways. I narrowed my eyes. This isn't in the official HOA bylaws. Margaret adjusted her designer glasses. It was revised last month. All residents were notified. I gritted my teeth. While I was out of town on business? Tom chuckled. Rules are rules. Margaret folded her hands on the desk, her voice dripping with condescension. We take property values very seriously here. Some of us can't afford to live in neighborhoods overrun with motorcycles. She said the word like it was a disease. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Instead of arguing, I pulled out my phone and started snapping photos of the updated rule. Margaret's smile flickered. Photography isn't allowed in the office. Interesting. I slipped my phone back into my pocket. Is that written down somewhere? As I turned to leave, I glanced back through the glass door. Tom had just slipped something into Margaret's desk drawer. That's when I noticed the security camera in the corner of the office. If I could get my hands on that footage, I had a feeling it would reveal more than they wanted me to see. They thought they were in control. But I was about to turn the tables. I drove home, my fingers tapping against the steering wheel. Margaret and Tom thought they had won, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. As soon as I got inside, I grabbed my laptop and logged into the HOA website. Something about that rule Margaret had quoted didn't sit right with me. I searched through the HOA's bylaws, looking for any record of the so-called revision banning motorcycles. 20 minutes and 4 cups of coffee later, I found it. Or rather, I didn't. The rule had never been officially approved. Margaret had simply added it to the website herself 3 months ago. And guess what happened around the same time? Tom Peterson's towing company won the HOA contract. I leaned back, heart pounding. This wasn't just an abuse of power. This was a full-scale scam. I kept digging. My neighbor, Sarah Wu, worked at the county clerk's office. She had once mentioned that HOA financial records were public information. I sent her a quick message and drove straight to her office. What she pulled up made my jaw drop. 6 months ago, Margaret had moved all HOA funds to a small, out-of-the-way bank. At first, that didn't seem suspicious, until Sarah showed me the board of directors. Tom Peterson was one of them. My pulse quickened. That meant Tom not only owned the towing company, He also controlled where all the HOA money went. But it got worse. Over the past 3 months alone, Peterson's Towing had received $47,000 in community enforcement fees. That was a ridiculous amount of money for a small neighborhood, and I wasn't the only victim. Sarah pulled up property sales records. My stomach twisted. Dozens of homes had been sold below market value. And the previous owners? Many of them had been hit with outrageous towing fines before selling. The pattern was clear. Margaret and Tom targeted homeowners with fake violations. They racked up thousands in towing and impound fees. If owners couldn't pay, they were pressured into selling. The homes were sold to shell companies linked to Tom and Margaret. This wasn't just about my bike. Margaret and Tom had been stealing from our entire community for years. Then I spotted them. Margaret and Tom were having lunch at a cafe across the street. Margaret laughed, waving a piece of paper, probably another violation notice. Tom scribbled something into a small notebook. They thought they were untouchable. I snapped a quick photo of them through the window. Not anymore. I had the evidence. Now, I needed to take them down. I sat in my car, gripping my phone as the weight of the situation sank in. Margaret and Tom weren't just HOA bullies. They were running a criminal enterprise. They had stolen millions from unsuspecting homeowners, all under the guise of property values. I had the proof, but evidence alone wouldn't be enough. Margaret had controlled this neighborhood for years. People feared her. If I wanted to take her down, I needed backup. That's when an idea hit me. I scrolled through my contacts and called an old friend, Ray Martinez, president of the State Motorcycle Rights Association. A no-nonsense advocate for bikers, Ray and I had fought together against unfair motorcycle laws before. If anyone knew how to rally a crowd, it was him. "Ray," I said when he picked up. "Remember when we fought that helmet law last year?" Ray laughed. "Yeah, what's up?" I took a deep breath. "I need a favor." By the time I hung up, my inbox was flooded with hundreds of emails from motorcycle clubs across the state. Word had spread like wildfire. Bikers weren't just angry about my Harley. They were furious about the HOA's discrimination against motorcycles in general, and they were ready to fight. Then, just as I was about to leave, my assistant Maria burst into my office, breathless. "Margaret's planning to auction off all abandoned vehicles this weekend," she said, slamming a notice onto my desk. "Your bike is on the list." I felt my blood boil. Margaret was trying to sell my Harley before I could do anything about it. That's when I realized she didn't know I was the CEO of Harley-Davidson. She had no clue that I had an army of bikers on my side. I smirked. Let her try. That night, I didn't sleep. I spent hours gathering every piece of evidence I had. Bank records, fraudulent HOA rules, shady property sales. I scanned and emailed everything to my legal team at Harley-Davidson. Then, I made one last call. "Jane Wong?" I said when the reporter picked up. "I think I have a story for you." There was a pause. Then, "How big?" I looked at the documents spread across my desk. Margaret and Tom's corruption laid bare. Front page news. The next morning, the storm began. Motorcycle clubs mobilized. News reporters started investigating. Even the district attorney's office caught wind of what was happening. Margaret thought she was untouchable. She had no idea what was coming for her. The morning of the auction arrived with crisp air and a bright blue sky. A perfect day for chaos. By 8 a.m., I was sipping my coffee on the front porch, waiting. The HOA's lot was packed with abandoned vehicles set to be sold off, including my Harley. Margaret likely thought this would be a simple, quiet sale. She had no idea what was about to hit her. At exactly 8:15 a.m., the first rumble reached my ears, then another and another. Within minutes, the distant hum of engines grew into a deafening roar as hundreds of motorcycles flooded the streets. Riders from Veterans Motorcycle Club, the Ladies of Chrome, the Classic Riders Association, and a dozen more groups poured into the neighborhood. Margaret, dressed in her usual pastel cardigan and pearl necklace, stood frozen near the auction tent, watering her roses. The garden hose slipped from her hands. "Tom!" she hissed into her phone. "Get over here, now!" But Tom had his own problems. Across town, news vans were already parked outside Peterson's Towing. Reporters had questions, and warrants were coming. I strolled up to Margaret, calm and collected. "Beautiful morning for a community gathering, isn't it?" Her face turned red. "You can't do this. This is private property." I pulled an envelope from my jacket and handed it to her. "This is a cease and desist order from my legal team. The vehicles you're trying to sell? Illegally towed. You have no right to auction them off." Her hands trembled as she flipped through the legal documents. She opened her mouth to protest, but before she could, Mrs. Chen, one of the elderly neighbors Margaret had bullied for years, stepped forward. "Actually, Margaret," Mrs. Chen said, holding up a stack of papers, "we checked the bylaws. There's nothing against organized community events." Behind her, the Rodriguez family set up a lemonade stand for the riders. The Patel kids ran around taking photos of the motorcycles for a school project. Even old Mr. Johnson, the grumpy neighbor who usually complained about everything, was in his garage, showing off his restored 1950 Harley-Davidson to an amazed crowd. Margaret's face turned purple as she watched the entire neighborhood turn against her. "I'm calling the police," she snapped, yanking out her phone. I pointed down the street. Officer Rivera, a longtime rider and local cop, was already there, munching on a cookie from Mrs. Chen's tray. He waved at us. "Already taken care of," I said. And speaking of the police, a black SUV pulled up. 2 officers stepped out, holding official documents. Margaret barely had time to react before they handed her a subpoena. "Margaret Whitmore," one of them said, "you're under investigation for fraud, embezzlement, and illegal property seizures." The last thing she saw before she turned pale. My Harley-Davidson, returned, polished, and parked in my driveway. Margaret stumbled back, her pearl necklace trembling as she clutched the subpoena. "This is a mistake," she sputtered, her voice cracking. "I was just enforcing the rules." "Rules," I interrupted, stepping closer. "You mean the fake rules you made up? Or the ones you used to steal from your neighbors?" The crowd around us grew, cameras rolling, microphones thrust forward. This wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. It was national news. Margaret turned to run, but before she could escape, a second subpoena was slapped into her hands. "That one's for Tom," I said with a smirk. "You might want to deliver it yourself. He's going to need a friend." Tom, who had been lurking near his truck, suddenly bolted toward his house. But it was too late. More officers were already there, knocking on his door. The entire neighborhood erupted into cheers. People hugged. Strangers became friends. For the first time in years, the fear that had loomed over our community vanished. I turned to the crowd, raising my voice over the excitement. "This isn't just about a motorcycle," I said. "This is about justice. It's about standing up to people who abuse their power." As I spoke, I watched the transformation unfold in real time. Mrs. Garcia, who had lost her son's first car to Margaret's scheme, was wiping tears from her eyes. The Martinez family, who had their work van towed, was already talking to the news crews. Mr. Patel, who never spoke up before, was now leading a conversation about how to rebuild our neighborhood the right way. Then, Mrs. Chen walked up to me, offering a fresh cookie from her tray. She smiled warmly. "Best Saturday morning ever," she said. I took the cookie and grinned. Couldn't agree more. Across the street, Margaret was still arguing with the officers, insisting this was all a mistake. But her reign of terror was over, and I wasn't done yet. That very afternoon, I called an emergency HOA meeting. With the entire community present, we held a vote. The results? Margaret and Tom were permanently removed from the HOA board. But we didn't stop there. Instead of replacing them with more power-hungry bureaucrats, we did something different. We started community-led initiatives, free motorcycle safety courses, a scholarship fund for young mechanics, and a monthly neighborhood bike show to bring people together. This neighborhood didn't need stricter rules. It needed community. 6 months later, I got an unexpected letter from Margaret's new neighborhood across town. She was complaining about motorcycle noise. I laughed and sent her back a Harley-Davidson catalog, along with a note. Bikes still available at employee discount. CEO. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't about getting even. It's about building something better from the wreckage of what your enemies tried to destroy. Looking back, Margaret and Tom weren't just greedy. They were opportunists who thrived on fear and silence. They counted on people backing down, on neighbors feeling too powerless to fight back. And for a long time, it worked. But here's the truth. Corruption only survives when people allow it. Margaret didn't lose because of legal technicalities. She lost because people united against her. She lost because we refused to stay silent. I learned that the most dangerous people aren't always the ones with the most power. It's the ones who abuse it. Whether it's in a small HOA, a workplace, or even a government, the moment people stop questioning authority, corruption takes root. Fighting back isn't always easy, but sometimes all it takes is one person willing to stand up. And sometimes, that one person is you. This story isn't just about a motorcycle. It's about knowing your rights. HOAs, landlords, bosses, and even local governments all have rules. But that doesn't mean they're always fair or legal. If something feels wrong, question it. Know your community's regulations. Never take rules are rules at face value. Read them yourself. Document everything. Emails, photos, timestamps. Proof wins battles. Build alliances. A single complaint is easy to ignore. A group, not so much. Use the power of publicity. When legal action fails, public pressure works. Margaret and Tom were untouchable for years, until they weren't. Because all it took was one fight, one voice, and one community coming together to bring them down. And that's how real change happens. If you've ever faced HOA abuse, shady business practices, or unfair rules, share your story in the comments. Your experience could help someone else fight back.